Happy holidays, everyone, and welcome to a Literary Lair mini-sode. I'm still taking some time for myself to focus on other things in my life. For the first time ever, I have a social calendar to think about. I know, me with a social calendar. You would think that fighting alternative versions of myself and building advanced AI would be among the most impressive things I've ever done, but it turns out having a social life is way more impressive. Anyway, I did want to make at least one video before the year was out, or at least I really hope that this video will be out before the end of the year, but, well, we'll have to see. So I wanted to count down my favorite books that I've read this year. I've certainly read a lot more this year working at a bookstore, so I will limit the list to only books that were released in 2022. But I did read a few older releases this year that I really liked and hope to do videos on one day if I can ever find the time. So without any further ado, here are my top 5 books of 2022. Take that, New York Times Best of the Year list. This book is a lot. What I mean is that it feels at times like it was multiple books crammed together. The book is very top-heavy, featuring a lot of plot threads that end up wrapped up nicely by the end of the book, but every chapter almost feels like the first chapter of a completely different novel. Maybe side stories or sequels that might have been that were instead crammed into the main narrative. Let me give you a very brief rundown of the premise of this book in the order it's presented in the story. It's got a transgender violinist who runs away from home, gets into a bad situation, and is rescued by a famous violin teacher who turns out to have made a deal with the demon and has to provide the souls of her students lest her own soul be forfeit to hell. At the same time, a family of aliens, led by their captain mom, are running a donut shop in California in order to escape an interstellar war in their home system, and are having issues adjusting to normal human life and keeping themselves hidden. And then, there's a woman who runs a music shop who lacks confidence in her abilities due to her father and grandfather beating it into her that their work was for men, and learning through the violin teacher and the student coming in to embrace her family vocation. There's a love story between the violin teacher and the alien, and do you see what I'm getting at? While this didn't hamper my enjoyment of the book at all, even though I thought it might have when I realized it was going in this direction. Everything gets wrapped up neatly in a nice little bow at the end, and despite being a bit of a clusterfuck, I wholly enjoyed the book. I still stand by that maybe it has too many narratives, but I think everything got a satisfactory ending. And it's probably the first sci-fi fantasy book I've read with a transgender violinist as the protagonist, so that's also pretty novel. Side note, I wrote a little display blurb for it at work, and I needed to consult 2 of my coworkers to figure out a polite way of saying it was a clusterfuck in all the best ways. I settled on calling it chaotic, but I like clusterfuck better. But what impressed me the most was that it billed itself as a sci-fi fantasy, and it actually was a literal sci-fi fantasy with demons and magic coexisting with aliens. Of course, this made me have a spoony Final Fantasy XIII opening cutscene moment as I tried to reconcile aliens coexisting with demons, but that's probably best saved for if I ever do a proper review of the book. Back in December, I noticed a lot of traction for a book called Station 11 by an author named Emily St. John Mandel, which is just an awesome name, if a bit of a mouthful, so I decided to check it out. At first, I was baffled because it was a book that got super popular during the pandemic that was about the aftermath of a major pandemic in the early 21st century. Weird, innit? But it was actually a really good book about the importance of art through major times of upheaval and tragedy. And then the author came out with another book earlier this year called Sea of Tranquility. And I wasn't going to buy it. I don't need another hardcover, but this one's got blue sprayed edges! But anyway, I made it a point to read it right after it came out because I loved Station 11 so much, and I really enjoyed it. It featured a lot of elements that I liked, a time loop, although it was sort of confusing because it tied into another of Emily St. John Mandel's books, The Glass Hotel, which I haven't read, although it wasn't a detriment. But I do wonder about the idea of like a literary universe connecting all these books together, especially when like this one and Station 11 are going to get a little more popular than perhaps some of her earlier work. This one also, for some reason, deals with a pandemic occurring in the far future, right after an author writes a book about the aftermath of a pandemic. Okay, this is getting ridiculous. What is this, an episode of She-Hulk or something? Stop being so meta! Anyway, it was a pretty interesting novel, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't know if I liked it as much as Station 11, but the main character's quest was very compelling as he attempted to do what he could for the greater good, in spite of what was allowed. Although, considering the author's self-insert, I was a tad disappointed that the author didn't use it to make reference to a potential television adaptation of the in-universe pandemic novel as a commentary on the real-life adaptation of Station 11 on HBO that left me simply whelmed. But that's a story for another video. One of the many benefits to working in a bookstore is that I get access to advanced reader's copies, or ARCs, of books before they come out, and one that I got in digital form through work was William Shatner's new book of essays. I've made it no secret my love of entertainment biographies and memoirs, and while usually I'd have listened to the audiobook, likely read by Shatner himself, because to me that's the prime way to listen, this one was a very special case because I really wanted to read it before it came out so that I could recommend the book to customers, and it was fantastic, particularly the part where Shatner discusses his trip into space, because it's not the reaction that you'd think he'd had. He looked into the void, and the void looked back, and he did not like that. But it also has a lot of powerful insights into his life, mortality, and our relationship with nature and animals, particularly pets, as Shatner is a dog lover, and it's especially poignant. As a Star Trek fan, I enjoyed his previous books up till now dealing with his own life, and Leonard, about his friendship with Leonard Nimoy, which is probably my favorite biography I've ever read, but this one is certainly up there. Obviously, this should go without saying that it is a must-read for any Trekkie. This one is a late edition, but should come as absolutely no surprise to anyone, because if you know me, you know that I love Jim Henson. But I have no idea where you would get that impression from. But what might surprise you is that I almost missed out on this book. I want to tell you a story about how I discovered that this book existed, because despite following no less than 3 Twitter accounts dedicated to the Muppets, I somehow missed that this book was coming out. It wasn't until a customer at work called the store and asked if we had the Salmon Friends book. Now, me being a huge Jim Henson fan and knowing that most people are not as obsessed with those felt-covered latex foam puppets, I typed in Salmon Friends, like the fish, into the search bar, and then clarified that they had in fact said Salmon Friends and felt incredibly embarrassed about the mix-up. It turned out to not be something we carried in the store, but I immediately ordered a copy for myself, in case you had any doubts. Salmon Friends was the first show that Jim Henson produced and starred in that aired in the Washington, D.C. area, and this book chronicles the early years of the show until the time that Henson picked up sticks and moved to New York City to get work on the myriad projects that would eventually lead to the Muppet Show's existence. It details Jim's early days, the audience reaction to the show, which they tried several times to cancel, but fans kept demanding their Salmon Friends, and details a lot of interesting history about the show that would otherwise be inaccessible because so many of the original episodes are lost to time because they were made in a time before, recording and archiving stuff, particularly before they knew that Jim Henson was going to become this larger-than-life icon. The author, Craig Shemin, worked for the Jim Henson Company as an archivist, among many other roles, so he certainly knows his stuff. And, fun fact, he's also married to Stephanie D'Abruzzo, who was a longtime Muppet performer, originated the role of Kate Monster in Avenue Q, and was the patient in the Scrubs musical episode My Musical. Yeah, the one that stood up to Dr. Cox and yelled at JD.
Shut your cake hole, Mary Beth, or I swear to God I'll shut it soon.
It's an interesting read, and as you can see, is also double-sized because it not only features the written biographical portion, but also a whole host of lists and episode scripts, music catalogs, and SK advertising scripts. So if you're a Muppet fan like I am, this is a great book to check out. It's sort of expensive because of how big it is and because it's a rather small publisher, who you might recognize if you've watched this season of MST3K, Bear Manor Media, but it's absolutely absolutely worth it. And it makes for a great double feature with the Brian J. Jones Jim Henson biography that I also just bought. Yeah, I'm surprised that I didn't already own this too. I can't articulate exactly why this book is so incredible without spoiling the entire narrative, which I don't want to do, but I'll try. The narrative is immediately compelling, and the characters are the type of characters you become incredibly attached to. My mark for whether something is good or not is being memorable. For example, I've definitely seen the movie Avatar all the way through at least once, probably twice. But I can't remember anything about it. It lacked memorability. I don't remember anything about the movies outside of the basic premise and the stuff people joke and meme about. Meanwhile, in between seasons 3 and 4 of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, sometimes I would just randomly be sitting at my computer and go, damn, that was a really good season finale. And this book is that type of memorable. I work in a bookstore, so naturally I see this book quite often. But I even think about it when I'm not looking at the book directly. It was also a book that I initially read from the library, bought a digital copy of when the loan ran out, because I didn't want to buy another hardcover that I can't really fit on the shelf, because this is designed more for paperbacks. And then I wanted it so badly and talked about it enough that a dear friend of mine gave me the arc that they had for it, which I will treasure forever, both because of sentimental reasons and also because of how much I love the book itself. As for the plot, the most I'll tell you is that it's about a trio of video game designers and the trials and tribulations of creating super popular video games and how that affects not only the whole world and the video game market, but the three of them individually. You'll laugh, you'll cry, and maybe, just maybe, you'll learn a little something about yourself. I know that's an MST3K reference, but it's actually really scarily accurate to the book. Anyway, go read this book if what I've said sounds at all interesting to you, and if you want to never look at the phrase, "you have died of dysentery" the same way again. And those were my top 5 books of 2022. It was by no means a comprehensive list, but if you're looking for some books to add to your TBR in the new year, these would be my picks. What books did you read in 2022 that you loved? Let me know in the comments. My TBR is miles long as it is, but I think I like adding books to it more than I actually like reading them. Anyway, hopefully I'll have more time for videos in the new year if I can figure out scheduling, and at the very least I'll see you in March for a yearly anniversary video. That is, if I can manage to actually get it out on time this year. We'll find out together. See you next time. Happy holidays, everyone, and welcome to another Literary Lair minisode. Today we're going to be talking about my top 5 books of 2022. And, well, you know, if I could... Well, I can't really pick them up right now, but I think you'll really like the show we have tonight.